run away again, I will not be angry with you. You shall live in my house and be one of my own servants." "I am one of the king's servants," said Christian. "That does not matter. The king's servants often run away from him. Besides, you were my servant when you were at my home, and you ought to be very glad that I'm willing to forgive you and take you back again." Poor little Christian felt that tears were coming into his eyes, and his lips began to tremble. But he answered, "I love the king. I would rather be his servant. Please let me go on." But Self had made up his mind that Christian should go home with him. So he said, "Don't be in a hurry. Just think of all the trouble you may meet with on the way. Our soldiers are up and down everywhere, and if they see you and try to hurt you, I don't suppose the king will take the trouble to help a child. You know you have served him very badly since you set out. You were so careless that you fell into the slough of despond, and you let worldly deceive you and turn you out of the right path. Then you slept in the arbor and lost your scroll. And when you came in sight of the lions, you were very nearly turning back for fear of them." Now, real quick, children, what's really important to see here is this is exactly how our enemy, Satan, talks with us. He accuses us of all the things that we've done wrong. And that's what self is doing right here, that sinful nature within us. So he continues. He says, "And yet at the palace beautiful, you talked as if you were one of the king's most faithful servants. I don't know how you can expect him to do anything for you." Little Christian knew that all these things were true, and he wondered how Self had heard about them. "I have been very sorry," he said, "and the king will forgive me. He knows I am only a little boy." Then Self could not keep back his anger any longer. He had been speaking gently because he wished Christian to forsake the king of his own accord. But when he saw that his words were of no use, he became fierce with passion. "I hate your king," he cried, "and everybody and everything belonging to him. You are my servant, and you shall never go to the celestial city, for I will kill you." And here's a picture of his anger starting to overflow. Yeah, it's kind of a picture of Satan, isn't it? Chapter 20, the first battle. Little Christian had scarcely time to put up his shield before Self began to throw fiery darts at him, and he feared that he would soon be killed by them. But the story of David and the giant that he had heard at the Palace Beautiful came into his mind, and he thought, David had only his shepherd's dress, and I am wearing the good armor that the king had given me. I will trust in him and try not to be afraid. So he held up his shield firmly on his arm and caught nearly all of Self's darts upon it, until the wicked soldier became wild with rage, and rushing suddenly at little Christian, he seized him in his strong arms. Those darts that Christian had not been able to catch upon his shield had struck him and wounded him in his hands and his feet. His wounds were very sore and were bleeding so much that he was beginning to feel faint. Self had seen this, and he flung the child upon the ground, thinking he would now be able to kill him. Little Christian had drawn out his sword from his sheath, but when Self threw him down, it fell from his hand, and he lay on the path. He thought he had now no chance of escaping his cruel enemy. But just as Self was going to strike his last blow, Christian saw the sword lay within his reach. He put out his hand and caught it up, and before Self had time to prevent him, he thrust it into the soldier's body and gave him a terrible wound. Now the soldiers of the wicked prince could not bear the pain of a wound given with one of the king's swords, and Self cried out when Christian struck him. Then the boy's courage came back to him, and he thrust the weapon at his enemy a second time. And after that, Self fled away across the valley, and Christian was left alone. Boys and girls, do you know what the sword represents in the king's armory? Does anybody know? What's that? That's a really good guess. The sword actually represents the Word of God. It's the Word of God that we use against Satan. Let's see, where was I now? He lay for a minute upon... Okay, I lost my place. It says, then the boy's courage came out back to him, and he thrust the weapon at his enemy a second time. And after that, Self fled away across the valley, and Christian was left alone. He lay for a minute upon the path, and then he got up and looked around. All over the grass lay the sharp darts that had been thrown at him, but Self was gone, and Christian could not see him anywhere. It was the king who helped me, he thought, and his heart was full of thankfulness for his wonderful deliverance. But the poor little soldier had been sadly wounded, and he felt so faint and ill that he was obliged to sit down upon the grass and lean his head against a great rock. He was weak and tired, and I think he must have fallen asleep, for he had a strange dream. He thought that his mother came across the valley, his own darling mother, whom he had lost so long ago. Her face shone as little Christian had seen the moonbeams shining on a dark night. A soft, silvery light seemed all around her. She was more beautiful than discretion, and her eyes, as she looked at him, were full of love and pity. Little Christian stretched out his hands to her, and she came toward him and knelt down on the grass and took him up in her arms. Then she tenderly dressed the wounds, and he lay quite still and wondered if she were an angel. She did not speak to him, but presently she laid him down again upon the grass, and then he felt her lips touch his forehead. "Mother, mother," he cried, and he opened his eyes, but she was not there. He was lying up by the rock, and he could see all down the long valley. He was quite alone. He sat up and looked at his wounds. They were not bleeding now, and they did not even ache. I must have been dreaming, he thought, and yet the wounds are all healed. Perhaps it was my mother. They said she would often be near me. Oh, I think the king must have sent her to help me when he saw I was sick and faint, or at least he must have sent one of his shining ones. Then he remembered that discretion had given him some food, so he sat still for a little while and ate the bread and the meat that she had given him. I must make haste, he thought, for I have lost so much time. I wonder whether Self has really gone quite away, or whether he will come back to look for me again. And he said that his soldiers were all around. I must be ready to meet them. So he kept his sword in his hand, and he looked carefully from side to side amongst the rocks and the bushes as he went along. Chapter 21, The Dark Valley. It was late in the afternoon when little Christian came to the end of the valley of humiliation. He had seen nothing more of his enemy Self, and he was beginning to think that he might now put his sword back into its sheath when he saw two little boys running toward him. Their faces were white as those of mistrust and timorous had been. And as they came up to him, Christian said to them, "Where are you going?" "Back, back," cried the boys. "If you care for your life, you had better come with us." "Why?" asked Christian. "What is the matter?" "Matter," they answered. "We were going to the celestial city as you are, but we have been as far as we dare. Indeed, if we had ventured a few steps further, we should never have had the chance to come back and save you." "What did you find?" said Christian, wondering what dangers he might have to pass through that night. He had no thought of turning back, for his victory over Self had made him love and trust his good king more than ever. But he wished to know what the boys had seen, so that he might be prepared to defend himself. "Just before us," they said, is the dark valley. But we saw it in time, and we have hurried away. What is it like? It's terrible. It's the most dreadful place we'd ever seen, full of darkness, and we could hear cries and groans of people in pain. No doubt they are pilgrims who have been lost there. The way of the king leads straight through it, said Christian. Then I do not see how we are to escape it, said one little boy. You can try if you like, said the other boy, but if we get to that city at all, it must be by some other road than that. So they left him. And little Christian went on, keeping his sword in his hand. So here's a picture of Christian meeting the two little boys. You can see where my finger is. They are running to meet him. And they're scared, and you can see kind of the dark valley behind him. Here's the dark valley right here. The dark valley lay much lower than the valley of humiliation. It was narrow, and the black rock seemed almost to meet over Christian's head as he entered it. The evening was coming on, and the path was soon surrounded by a thick mist, so that he could scarcely see his hand when he stretched it out before him. Flashes of light kept breaking through the mist, but he did not know whether they were flames of fire or lightning, and the air was filled with terrible sounds, which made his heart beat fast with fear. By the light of the flames, he saw that the path upon which he was walking was a very dangerous one. On his right hand, there was a very deep hollow, and on his left, a marsh. And it was all he could do to prevent himself from slipping into either one. I think that this walk through the dark valley was the worst part of Christian's pilgrimage. Although he tried to think of the king and his goodness, he could not help being frightened. And in one part of the valley, where some of the wicked prince's servants were waiting to trouble the pilgrims, a man came up behind him and whispered bad words in his ear. Little Christian could not see the man, and he was so confused that he thought that he said the wicked words himself, and he feared the king would be angry with him. About the middle of the night, as he was walking slowly along in the darkness, he heard footsteps in the distance. Some people were coming toward him, shouting and uttering dreadful cries. He knew that it must be a band of the wicked prince's servants, and he thought, they will hurt me and perhaps kill me altogether. He wondered whether he should turn back, for he was becoming so frightened that his body was trembling. But he had already come a long distance through the valley, and he said to himself, perhaps I'm not far from the end of it, and going back would be worse than going forward. Presently he found that the wicked soldiers had taken a different path, and they did not meet him at all. And now little Christian was comforted in his loneliness by hearing the voice of a pilgrim who was repeating aloud some of the beautiful words that were written in the king's book. It was too dark for him to see who the pilgrim was, but he hoped that it might be who? Who do you think? Faithful. And that he would soon be able to overtake him. At last he called out to him, but although Faithful heard Christian speak, he did not know who might be wishing to stop him, so he made no answer. Still, little Christian knew he was there, and he felt less frightened than when he thought that he was alone. And this is just like the Christian life. When we have friends with us to walk down the path to the celestial city, we're less afraid. Chapter 22. Little Christian overtakes Faithful. Little Christian had no rest that night. He did not dare lie down and sleep in the dark valley, for he feared lest the wicked soldiers whom he could hear passing up and down the rocks would find him and put him to death or bring him back to the city of destruction. He was very tired, but he walked bravely on through the midst and the darkness, praying in his heart that the king would watch over him. And after a time he thought of some words that he had read in the king's book. He shall give his angels charge over thee. Then he remembered the picture that Charity loves so much of the little child with the guardian angel. The picture was true, he said to himself. That little child was walking on a path like this, and the king's angel was taking care of him. Perhaps there is an angel with me now. I'm sure you know that little Christian was quite right. The angel had been with him all through the dreadful night. And although the little pilgrim could not see the bright guardian, there were gentle hands spread out to shield him from the terrors of the way, and strong arms ready to hold him fast if his feet slipped on the dangerous path. At last the mist began to roll away, and a soft, pale light shone overhead. Little Christian looked up and found that he could now see a strip of sky between the overhanging rocks, and he knew that the day was breaking. As the sun rose, its glorious rays streamed even into the dark valley. He stood still and looked behind him. The black rocks that surrounded him and the narrow track with the treacherous marsh on one side and the steep precipice on the other seemed more fearful than they had been in the darkness. Little Christian wondered how he had ever come safely through such a dreadful place. Then he looked forward, and he felt more and more thankful that the sun had risen, for he saw that the rest of the path was strewn with snares and nets, which the wicked soldiers had laid there to hinder and hurt the king's pilgrims. They had also dug holes in dangerous places and done everything that they could to make the road difficult and unsafe, so that Christian thought, if I had passed over it in the darkness, I should very likely have fallen and crippled myself. At the end of the dark valley, there was a cave in the side of the mountain, and in this cave were two very powerful giants who lived there. Whenever pilgrim passed by their dwelling, the giants attacked the pilgrims and tried to kill them. And for a long time, this was one of the most dangerous places on the way to the celestial city. But one of the giants died, and the other grew old, and his limbs became stiff, so that he could no longer rush out upon the pilgrims. When little Christian came near to the cave, he saw the old giant sitting outside of it. He felt a little frightened, but the giant did not move, so he walked straight on. The giant was full of rage when he saw him, and he would have liked to seize the boy and drag him into his cave, but he had no strength left, and little Christian passed on safely. The dark valley with all of its terror now lay behind him, and just before him the ground rose a little. Christian climbed quickly up the path, and when he had reached the top of the ascent, he found that he could see for some distance along the road. Not very far from him, a boy was walking with his face toward the king's city. He was wearing a white suit like Christian's, but he had no armor. It must be Faithful, thought Christian as he called out. Wait for me and I will walk with you. Then Faithful looked around and Christian cried again, Wait till I overtake you. But Faithful answered, I'm going to the king, and there are enemies behind me. When Christian saw that Faithful would not wait for him, he felt vexed and began to run as fast as he can. He soon caught Faithful, and instead of stepping by his side, he ran on further so that Faithful in his turn might be left behind. But he forgot to look where he was going, and striking his foot against a stone, he fell to the ground, and Faithful had to hurry after him to help him up. So here's a picture of Faithful helping Christian up off the ground. Little boy, Dad. Mm-hmm. Little boy was, no. Their boys. So that's where we'll end today. Christian finally has a friend to walk with him on this journey, and next time we'll see how their dangers increase even more.